Here we go. We are now recording, and let me get up my PDFs. Good. So what I usually like to do in these sessions is to start with summaries. And it's actually one of the hardest things to do, to accurately and charitably summarize what you've read. In this case, it's maybe even slightly harder to do it charitably just because these are excerpts and you don't, at least, I mean, for two reasons, it's hard to do it charitably. One, Schopenhauer has a pretty extravagant story about the way things like our cognition or awareness of the physical world and even specific things like music are emanations or manifestations or somehow expressions of this underlying force or one could say a sort of energistic um, uh, field or something like that called will, which already starts to sound pretty um, implausible. He actually does give very um, concrete and penetrating arguments, but it's just the nature of the argument he's trying to defend. Um, it's really trying to put together a picture of the whole world as interrelated. I mean, I suppose a lot of philosophers do that, but he seems to have a fairly extravagant metaphysical story to tell. And so that might be one of the things that makes it hard to go along with him all the way. The other thing, however, about the reading that I gave you is that there are gaps in the argument, especially in the first section that I gave you. And so one thing that we might want to do after we summarize the assertions. He kind of tells you this is the way the world is. He doesn't really defend it in the excerpts that I gave you, but you can reconstruct the argument from what I gave you. So that might be um, a fun or at least a informative activity. But let's jump into summarizing the excerpts, the three excerpts I gave you. Uh, and we could start at a kind of high level. What are the main topics that he's talking about in each of the three, and then um, try to get more granular for each of them. All right, who wants to
I
bite?
can I can give it a try.
Okay, great.
So just I'll in just really basic terms, it seems like he's giving an introduction of the will, and there is
Yeah. So,
some focus.
what this is going to help you for the rest of your life if you can think about when you're summarizing to start kind of generally and probably in your first sentence, you don't want to jump straight into a technical term. Will is a
Oh,
technical term in Schopenhauer. It sounds like it's some kind of spooky, new agey, mystical thing, but it's actually a fairly, oh, we lost Yonatan. It's actually a fairly, you could say, logical term, actually. And so maybe we would want to hold off on introducing it until we get kind of a picture of what he's trying to do. Why even write this thing at all?
oh, okay.
Yeah, Eddie, you want to say something? Oh, no.
Uh, Never mind. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. Go ahead, Arshia.
So in that case, let's see. I have to kind of rearrange my thoughts now. Well, okay. If without using the technical terms, then I suppose he just wants to give an account of the driving forces behind maybe just desires and not even just exclusive to humans, but also that which kind of drives the world. Uh, I'm being like really vague to as to avoid
Yeah,
any terms.
yeah. Well, that's fine. It's fine to be general. However, I'm not sure that that really captures the main concerns. But go ahead, Eddie. Were you that time
Can
you
I
have your
can I
hand?
give it a try?
Yeah, sure.
I had a really hard time understanding any of this, so I only got through the first one, but I think um I think what at least from this summary beforehand, it seems like he's kind of exploring the distinction that we've made between the physical world and like the conceptual or the abstract
Hmm.
world, and rather than arguing for sort of the mental or the abstract as something that can be seen through the lens of the physical, he is arguing that everything in the physical world can be seen through the lens of the mental or the abstract.
Yeah, okay.
I'm
Um,
having a hard
you're,
time
you're
with
you're
the
doing something really good
terminology.
though. You're doing something really good, which is you have, I think, delineated the terms of the argument. I think that maybe you got it the other way around to a certain extent. But yes, you're absolutely right. So, one thing that we might think is that, as far as we know, I mean, animals have consciousness to an extent and so on. But one thing that we're certain of is that we're able to ask about our place in the world. We're aware of the fact that we're in the world and so on, right? And so that is one power that humans have that enable us to ask certain questions like why? Most likely, actually, it's really interesting. I don't think animals have a concept of why. The reason that I think that, of course, that's not something that is necessarily borne out in empirical science. However, there is exactly one modern example of a child that was found at the age of 12 who was in a really abusive home or something, and by the age of 12 had not learned any language. And this child was then like, taken into a hospital, and they, after she was cared for on a physical level, they started working on language skills. And she got pretty good at naming things, remembering names, understanding, assertive relationships like, the cat is on the mat or something like that. But the one thing that she was never able to even comprehend was questions.
Hmm.
It's sort of an interesting thing. Of course, that's only a single example, and from what I gather, um, it is pretty useless for constructing any kind of theory because you can't uh, distinguish between, things like damage from abuse or, pre-existing mental illness or this kind of thing. You can't distinguish that from the fact that she didn't learn language until she was 12. But it is sort of interesting that she wasn't completely non-linguistic. She did learn some language, but what she could not wrap her head around was the idea of what a question is. So that's sort of interesting. It's quite possible that, you know, the ability to question is something that only beings that have language, in the sense that, human language is a language, the ability to refer and perform transformational functions, grammatical functions, and so on, that is um, a necessary condition for being able to even comprehend a question.
Hmm.
But one thing that's important is that we know that we are never satisfied unless we ask questions about everything. One of the things in Schopenhauer's work before this, his doctoral dissertation, one of the things that he puts forward is the idea that um, the question why is constitutive, or at least the ability to ask why, or um, the sense that whenever you encounter anything in the world, one of the things that's entailed in your awareness of it at all is that you could ask why about it. Why does it exist? Right? So you know how, for those of you who have done some work with Kant, you know that Kant has this idea that there are certain kind of mental operations or certain things that uh, are presupposed in experience. Like you can never see an object as not being in a chain of cause and effect. Uh, so to consider something or posit something as not in a chain of cause and effect means you're not positing it as an object. one of the things that Schopenhauer develops in the work before this is the idea that the question why, which he calls the principle of sufficient reason, is something that's baked into our awareness of the world. You can never encounter the world without also encountering it as the sort of thing about which you could ask the question why, right? And so that ability to ask why is something that is significant and uh, just a necessary condition of human experience. So then we would want to ask the question, okay, so why do I experience the world in the way that I do? Um, and what that means is what we're trying to do is explain the world. We're trying to understand, in some sense, somehow grasp the world. Uh, and generally, in the history of philosophy, the way that philosophers have done that is to consider thought as the most adequate way of grasping the world. That's a kind of complicated way to say that if I want to know the world, how can I know it? Well, philosophers generally in the past, before Schopenhauer, would have said you have to think about it, right? That's what it means to understand. You can't get to understanding without thinking, right? Um, and what Schopenhauer wants to do is say that that is fine to a certain extent, but there are all sorts of shortcomings. You don't ever actually grasp the world through thinking. Because, for one thing, thinking is sort of like building a model of the world. It's always not the world, but uh, a model version of the world. And the one thing that he says that, for whatever reason, all philosophers before him had forgotten is that in addition to thinking about the world, we are also bodies in the world. So we are also objects. We aren't just these disembodied minds thinking about the world in order to grasp it. We're also already in the world as objects, our bodies. And it's not just that we have bodies and they're sort of inert or we're not really aware of what our bodies are doing or whatever. We also have immediate, um, he would use the term feeling. We have some kind of immediate awareness of what it's like to be in a body, right? But what it's like to be in a body is not a thought about the body. It's not a concept of body or something like that. It's some other direct apprehension of the world, not through thought, but through embodiment, right? So that's the really key step that he makes. If you want to know the world, thinking about it is actually going to take you further away from it because the best you can do is make a model of it. If you really want to know the world, you have to be aware of your experience as a body in that world, as essentially part of the world, instead of trying to get outside of it and taking a stand on it in thought, right? So, there's a sort of embodiment thesis here. You could even say a sort of physicalist thesis, perhaps. Now, of course, he's often called an idealist, someone who holds that the world um, is either only available to us through the mind, or sometimes idealism is used to refer to the idea that the world is itself just a mental construct or something like that. And to a certain extent, that is descriptive of Schopenhauer. It's just that um, there are two distinct ways that we come into contact with the world, or that we come into awareness of the world. And there's the approach to the world that we can talk about, that we can have, concrete, discursive, conceptual, informational conversations about, and that would be mental. But at the very same time, we come into contact with the very same world through being embodied in the world, being essentially the world, right? That is to say, later on, he will develop the idea that things like distinction and individuality and so on are actually not the true condition of the world. That is just a mental construct. The idea that every object or every person or whatever is distinct, that's a mental construct. Um, and so I haven't given you the argument for that yet, but if that's true, if distinction is something that only exists mentally, but mental apprehension of the world doesn't really get you in contact with the world, then it means that the way that you can get into contact with the world, embodiment, reveals to you that the world is all one, which means that in knowing that you are also, quote unquote, in the world, that means you are the world. It doesn't mean you're the totality of the world, but it means you're completely inseparable and indistinct from the world. So we'll develop that idea in a moment too, because it's maybe a little bit complicated to think about how something could not be the entirety of X and yet also um, be indistinct from it. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, good. Okay.
Uh, I
Any
was thinking,
questions on any of that?
yeah, I was thinking about this distinction between internal and external, or even like mind and matter, or,
Uh-huh.
and how this distinction is like actually conflated, or they're actually one and the same almost in Schopenhauer's thought. So, okay, if you think about the internal world, right, and how he talks about like the will emerging or us being like really like intimately in contact with our self-consciousness or whatever it is, and that's internal, and that's not spatial, right? Because it's
Yeah, that's right. Isn't yeah.
then talking about the external world, then we get to the realm of objects, or let's say representations in Schopenhauer's term. Um, and it seems to me that he's saying that they are one and the same. This
What's
distinct
one and the same?
that
Things are one
the
and the same.
mind and matter are
Ah,
talking,
well,
talking about
it depends on what you mean by one and the same. If you're saying that mind and matter put you in touch with one and the same thing, the world, that would be true. But they're not one and the same thing from the following perspective. They are two distinct ways of coming into awareness of the world.
right. Yes.
So he talks about the world being given to us in two entirely distinct ways. It's one world that's given to us, but it's given to us in two distinct ways. It's given to us through thought, and it's given to us through bodily awareness, bodily engagement, and so on.
So it has to do in a way with the cognitive system on the one side and the sensory system on the other, or something like that.
What was the beginning of your sentence? Doing away with
It
that?
has to do with the cognitive system as opposed to, or as
Sort
walking
of,
side by side
sort of,
with
sort of. It
sensory
doesn't
system.
cleanly divide that way just because he thinks that sensation itself, following Kant, introduces certain things that are not actually um, conditions of the world itself. Here's what I mean. Okay, so we've talked about space and time as though they're just sort of givens that are part of the world. But there are all sorts of reasons to doubt that the world as it exists is either spatial or temporal in the way that we mean it when we invoke concepts like space and time. Anybody think of arguments? The argument against time as we now, what I'm not arguing is that there is nothing that might have some kind of relational property to it that would be similar to time in the world as it is in itself. What I am saying is that that specific relational property that we call time can't possibly exist in the world in itself. Anybody think of, there's a really simple argument for that. I think the first person who gave it was Aquinas. But can anybody think of what is paradoxical or yeah, paradoxical, or yes, paradoxical, I suppose would be. It's either aporetic or paradoxical about time. Yeah, Eddie.
The example with the arrow, like if you were to fire an arrow and take a moment, in
Mhm.
that moment the arrow is not moving. And if you were to take another moment, in that moment the arrow is also not moving. So the arrow somehow manages to travel, but if you take this series of fixed moments, how is it that the arrow has traveled if
Yeah,
it's never moving?
so that is an argument against change, right? And that's sometimes called Zeno's paradox. Yeah, this idea that If you take, and it's actually kind of related to the other argument against time, but yeah, if you were somehow able to get a time slice that were atomic, in other words, where you could no longer divide it, then what you would find is that anything that is moving or changing is actually static at each of those time points, right? Um, Now, of course, the other thing about time is that if you were to try to put together a definition of what time is, you'd probably have to invoke phenomena like change. Time just means some way of measuring change, right? If nothing ever changes, then time is an incoherent concept, right? We do experience change. So I guess by modus tollens, you can uh, say that. Well, I'm not going to, I might be wrong about that. I have to look at the subjects. But anyway, um, yeah, so that might be one way to get at it. That would require us to posit indivisible time points. The only problem with that is that if you take the spatial form of that paradox, you might say, okay, so the arrow reaches the target, but before it reaches the target, it has to reach halfway to the target, and then it has to reach halfway of halfway and halfway of halfway of halfway, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, into infinity, right? If you were to take the temporal version of that, then that would suggest that there is no way to ever get to an atomic time point because it's always infinitely divisible, right? That still doesn't tell us, though, that the world isn't infinitely divisible. It might be that we actually can somehow contemplate the world, even though we experience it as we don't really experience time in terms of time points. So that's already something that's a little bit um, removed from our experience. In that paradox, it requires that we consider time in terms of points or states, but that's not really how we experience time. So then you could say, well, okay, that's all well and good for that version of time, but that's not actually how we experience time. Um, Another way we might think about putting together an argument for the impossibility of our experience of time actually being real is to simply ask for any given object or for anything, any event or whatever, there are three different temporal modes that we could be talking about. We can be talking about past, present, or future. And then we might want to ask which of these is real. Certainly, whatever is past no longer exists. Or maybe we should say whatever is future no longer exists. Maybe there's some sense in which a past event can exist in our memory, but it's certainly not the thing. The memory is not the same thing as that which existed, right? So neither the past nor the present, or I'm sorry, neither the past nor the future exist. So then that only leaves us with the present. The only problem is that the present is like a geometrical point. It has no dimension to it at all. So then that means that what is past no longer exists. What is future does not yet exist. What is present doesn't exist because there is no temporal dimension within which it can exist because the present is always this fleeting point, right? There is no actual dimension to it. And so that means that everything we experience in time does not exist or is not real, right? Um, So that would be one way of getting to this idea that, well, okay, so, but we do experience the world as being in time. So that leads certain thinkers like Kant and Schopenhauer following Kant to posit that time is not a property of the world as it is in itself. It's a property of our experience of the world or our sensation of the world. You can never have any experience or awareness whatsoever except in time. Anything you experience in the world is in time. Even your own thoughts are in time. So it's something that's true both of the inner and the outer. And yet, it seems fairly obvious that it's insufficient for getting to the reality of the world because we just demonstrated that at no point in the succession of past, present, future is the object we're talking about real from the point of view of the passage of time, right? And so that's an argument against the reality of time and an argument for the ideality of time. But one thing that's really important to remember here, and this gets to your point, Yonatan, about this division between the cognitive and the perceptual, it's not a clean division because the perceptual requires time, but the perceptual is not the same thing as feeling or this kind of embodiment in the world, right? It's kind of a tenuous argument to an extent. One of the things that he develops, and I don't think he defends, he just kind of takes full sail from Kant, is this distinction between sensation and feeling. Okay, so sensation is whatever we can become aware of, or that faculty of becoming aware of the world that involves our sensory organs, essentially. And maybe there's some, cognitive processing because we sense it not just sort of as raw data, but raw data in space and time, right? And so,
Feeling is a interpretation of the sensation or something like that.
what?
And the feeling is different than sensation
So
in
here's the
that
thing.
it follows an interpretation or something like that. It is
No,
being
no, that's not right. The distinction is that, according to Kant anyway, in the third critique, feeling is like inner sense because it doesn't use things like eyes and noses and mouths and so on. But I don't think that's right because it does seem like you can't get to feeling except through something like touch. I'm not so sure. I mean, in the 19th century, people like William James and others developed this idea that emotion actually just is our response to the feeling of touch inside our own bodies. So that, whatever the things are that we often attribute the status of effects to, effects of emotion. So like you're angry, and so whatever, your face gets flushed or something. You turn red. Um, William James develops the idea that no, it's actually the feeling of your face filling with blood. That is what anger is. Or, if you're nervous and your heart beats faster and whatever the other things are, that uh, we often attribute the cause. So we attribute causality to nervousness, and then we attribute the status of effects to all those, things that happen to you when you are nervous. That just is what it is. That emotion essentially is touch. I guess and so it's a basically behaviorist kind of thesis, right? So that would suggest that feeling, I don't know, maybe feeling isn't anything other than our awareness of touch, of, whatever, the way that it feels when our heart beats faster or whatever, and that's what it is to be emotion. But then, of course, you could imagine a super Spartan or some, person that has been trained not to express their emotions that still feel the emotion or still maybe, you could imagine someone who, well, I'm not sure. Is it possible to imagine being angry, but having so much control over yourself that you can keep your heart from racing or keep whatever other physiognomic changes from happening, even though you feel angry? Is it possible to have like purely mental anger? You know? And then there are other sort of strange emotions like respect or something like this. It does seem right to say that emotion or feeling or whatever, now emotion is not exactly the same thing as feeling. Kant defines feeling as essentially non-conceptual, and emotions are usually bound up with concepts. You are angry because of P or whatever. But nonetheless, I mean, is it possible to think of feelings as, in some sense, or I suppose completely mental and not physical at all, not related to touch? Or maybe another thing to get at is if we're talking about feelings, can we exhaust the notion feeling in just a list of different body states? Different things that are happening to your body. Does it really make sense to have that distinction between inner sense, feeling, and outer sense, sensation, or is feeling just a further sensation of your own body? Schopenhauer seems to think that feeling is distinct from sensation in that sense of outer sense. Um, I suppose one thing that he might argue for is just the idea that when you do feel an emotion or have that sense of feeling, that it's fairly hard to distinguish what the sensations are, right? So, like, with sight, it's certainly true that the visual field comes to me as a whole, but I can make all sorts of distinctions very easily. Like now I'm looking at my window, now I'm looking at my lamp, right? And even within that, I'm looking at my lamp, and now I can distinguish all the various details of my lamp and so on. With feeling, it's much harder to make those kinds of distinctions. Maybe it's not impossible, but it does seem like that would be a significant difference, at least between sight and feeling. The only problem is that most of the other senses are not as good at distinguishing as sight is. I think with hearing is probably the second most salient sense, and your ability to distinguish things in hearing goes down quite a bit from sight. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why it's always hard if you are teaching like music appreciation or something. You know, um, you play some piece of music and you say, "Didn't you hear the dominant go to the tonic?" Um, Most of the time, it's a fairly common occurrence that a student will say, "Yeah, I understand that the dominant goes to the tonic. I just can't hear it." But they would never say something like, "Yeah, I understand that the Egyptians built the pyramid, but I just can't see the pyramid." Maybe that's not an exact analogy, but you get the idea that hearing is quite a bit less uh, powerful when it comes to distinguishing in sensation. And I suppose touch, I don't know. Maybe touch is less. I would say that smelling or taste for us is probably much less than hearing, right? We are not very good at distinguishing through smelling or through taste in comparison with sight or even hearing, right? And so I think that his argument is essentially that there's perhaps some kind of inner sense, which we can call feeling, that um, gives us a very immediate awareness, but it's very hard to think about in terms of distinction, in terms of distinguishing the things that are in that field of feeling. Um, and so, that is what, however, what he thinks is putting us in touch with reality, feeling, not sensation from the point of view of being able to distinguish things in space and time through sight or this kind of thing, but rather feeling as this immediate, indistinguished sort of mass, this sort of unity that nonetheless is subject to change, right? Because feelings come and go. They don't sort of last forever in comparison to, say, necessary truths or certain other functions of thought. Feelings are changeable. They're also immediate, and they're also kind of whole, right? They're not easily analyzable in the way that a visual field is easily analyzable. You can pick out all the different chunks of it or all the different details in it, right? I think that that's the background that he's arguing from. Yeah.
I still don't, I'm not super clear on the distinction between feelings and emotions. What's an example of a feeling?
Um, well, the problem with feeling, if we're following Kant, is that it's non-discursive. So
Mm.
to give you an example is impossible because what I would have to do is somehow make my body your body. I can't
Oh, I
communicate
see.
with God.
Is it, could we say that feeling is essentially understanding of some qualia or something like that? where it's just kind
Well,
of
okay, so like the paradigm example for feeling in Kant, I'll get to you in a second, Eddie. The paradigm example where he really, in fact, where he introduces that term is in the analytic of the beautiful. And so the experience or the judgment that's beautiful, what's in the P, so that is beautiful, or, whatever, that tree is beautiful, or Sandesh is beautiful, however you want to form that sentence, has the following structure. S is P. Sandesh is some kind of thing that I'm predicating of Sandesh, right? What Kant says is that in aesthetic judgments, maybe before I get to aesthetic judgments, I'll say usually what goes in the P location, the P function in that thing is a general concept. The S always has to be less general than the P. You can't say, for instance, beautiful is, I mean, grammatically, it doesn't make sense. Sometimes you might write a poem that inverts word order, and so you might say, oh, well, it does make sense to me because it sounds poetic or something. But if you really think about what's going on in the structure of predication, you can't predicate something less general of something more general. In other words, I can't say um, beautiful is Sandish. That doesn't make any sense because there's nothing to accept the predicate Sandish in the concept beautiful. Okay, so usually what happens in SSP is that the more general concept goes in the P location, but it's a concept. If you want to have a meaningful sentence, the P had better be a concept, right? So what Kant says about aesthetic judgment, however, is that what goes in the P is feeling and not a concept, right? So yeah, so it's like the statement S is beautiful is not giving you some kind of concept beautiful. Rather, beautiful is it's maybe something that it's a word we use or whatever, but what it actually is not a concept, it's a feeling. I don't know if you remember there are a bunch of arguments for why it's not a concept, why it must be a feeling. One of the reasons is that you can never give an adequate definition discursively, right? And yet at the same time, it has the sense of universality that concepts have. It's just that when you actually do try to form it into a concept, that communication fails because there is no way to bring the feeling full sail into a concept. Feelings are particular and immediate and so on, and concepts are abstract and general and so on. And so there's always going to be this disconnect. So when you ask me, like, what's an example of a feeling? All I can do is try to remind you of a time that you had a feeling. I can't.
mm,
A feeling is this. These are the jointly necessary and sufficient conditions or whatever. What I can do is say, whatever.
yeah, no, got it. That makes sense,
Yeah.
actually.
So, and that's a claim that Schopenhauer makes, I think, in this excerpt, certainly in the wider work, The World as Will and Representation. He makes the claim that concepts are sort of like promissory notes. Like, so a promissory note is like a check, right? Like you take a check to a bank, and back in the old days, you could exchange your promissory note for gold. Not that gold has intrinsic value, but the idea is that experiences are the gold that can be exchanged for the abstractions of promissory notes. But without the gold, the promissory note has no value, right? Concepts have no value without the experience that they reference. But the experience is not itself the concept, right? The concept is an abstraction from a generalization over experience. But then if you want me to tell you, like, okay, what is an experience? What is a feeling or something? The best I can do is make you have a feeling. I can't tell you what a feeling is. I can try to make you have a feeling. I can show, I can't say.
Yeah, Kant has this thing that he says that intuition without concepts are blind, and concepts without intuition are empty. And it's sort of the same thing talking about experience and, let's say, emotion or something like that, right?
Yeah, he does say that. That said, in the context, however, of epistemology, our capacity to form true sentences. Well, he doesn't talk about sentences, but our capacity to know through experience, right? The problem with aesthetics is that it's not obviously about knowledge.
Mhm.
In the same way that the epistemology is. What that phrase is supposed to demonstrate, or at least probably not demonstrate, certainly just assert, is that thinking alone can't actually tell you anything about the world. You first have to experience the world. So that's the percepts, the experience the world, and then you can think about your experiences, the concepts. If you never had any experiences, no percepts, your concepts would be empty. In other words, they wouldn't be talking about anything,
Mhm.
right? Like if I were to just start saying a bunch of concepts, I don't know what I maybe for those of you who haven't done a bunch of philosophy, I can just start talking about a priori justification of the ontological argument or something. It's like, okay, you said a bunch of words, but it doesn't mean anything because you don't have experiences to draw on that can populate those concepts, right? Um, so that is to say that concepts without percepts or without intuition, they're empty. However, percepts, if you only experienced and had no capacity to generalize about your experience, or to think about your experience, you'd just be blind. You'd just be moving through the world doing whatever, but there would be no direction, no organization to it. Right? That's what that sentence is meant to assert. Um, it's a slightly different distinction that we're getting to here with the difference between, say, concepts and feelings, but it's related, right? I mean, it's this idea that um, we encounter the world or we try to grasp the world through two different vehicles or whatever, thinking about the world or just experiencing the world, right? For Kant, uh, it's quite complicated because he thinks that these two modes of apprehending the world are really tangled up with each other. It does seem that Schopenhauer wants to simplify it a little bit and say that experience or feeling or the non-conceptual whatever actually does get us in immediate contact with the world because at that moment we realize that there's not me and the world, but it's just one thing, right? Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that feelings are in some way or form physical states? Say, I feel tired, I feel sick, I feel frustrated, but these are not emotions, right?
Yeah. Um, well, feeling is a technical term here. So the way that Kant uses it is not to be confused with the way that we might use it in other sentences in ordinary language. It's specifically inner sense, which is to say some kind of non-conceptual immediate apprehension of X or whatever, right? So um, what I would say about that is that that sounds more like sensation, right? Like when I feel sick, I feel that there is some blockage in my sinus or
But
something.
frustration is not
The
such that you
frustration,
could
though, but that is an emotion, right? So, but that is one of the questions that I was raising before. Can we cleanly get some aspect of feeling separated from, physical sensation, or is physical sensation, can we exhaustively define feeling in terms of physical sensation? That's uh, sort of an open question. However, I will say that Schopenhauer seems to assert that they are distinct. Sensation and feeling are distinct. Do you want to say something, Eddie?
I just wanted to ask, clarifying the technical term
Uh,
feeling. If compared to emotion, would feeling refer to the experience of the experience itself, including the affect, and the emotion is like the emotion is like the word that we use to symbolize it. Is that
So that's sort of interesting. I should say a couple things. First of all, emotion is a more contemporary term. I don't believe Kant ever uses the term emotion. Uh, the term in the 17th and 18th century would have been something more like passion, which etymologically means that you are the effect of some cause. Your state is the effect of some cause, as opposed to, say, a reason, right? So when I have a passion, it means my body is being affected like an object, right? Emotion is a concept that, as far as I understand, um, the way people typically use it involves some kind of cognitive state. That is to say, I'm angry because P, right? Or, uh, there's some kind of uh, content efficacy to the mental state that um, involves the emotion, right? So, somebody says something mean to you. So like I could yell a bunch of like really mean epithets at one of you. And if you understand the language, um, then you might feel sad. Whereas if I just said the same things but in a language you don't understand, you maybe would be confused, but you wouldn't feel sad because there's no conceptual component there if you don't understand what's being said. But if you do understand what's being said and you understand, oh, that person's insulting me, there's a cognitive state that might be warranted or not. Maybe I am being mean to you, maybe I'm not being mean to you, but nonetheless, you have to have that cognitive state in place to have the emotion because you're angry about something, right? There is some kind of object that your anger is directed towards, or that is the cause of your anger, or something like that, right? And uh, I suppose it's possible to describe anger where you don't know what in the technical term is the intentional object of your anger is, what you're angry about. But generally, say in psychotherapy, uh, the understanding is that it's not that there is no object that you're angry about. It's just that you can't recognize or identify the object. But there's got to be something you're angry about, right? And that's perhaps different from feeling because feeling doesn't have to have that. In fact, as far as I understand, feeling has no intentionality to it. I should define intentionality. Intentionality just means the capacity of a mental state to be about something. What's that? I hear some music. Anybody? Yeah. Okay. The capacity of a mental state to be about something is its intentionality. So just remember that word because it's kind of important to understanding what Schopenhauer is getting at here. Schopenhauer doesn't use that term, but he was very influential on the person who popularized that term, Franz Brentano, a few decades after Schopenhauer. But the idea is that mental states are about something. You're angry about what happened. You are thinking about what happened. You are, to the extent that in looking at a tree, I don't just have a bunch of bare sensations. I have this sense that my looking is directed at the object tree, right? There's a direct object in that verb or to that verb, right? Um, so that is known as intentionality. But this can doesn't have intentionality. This can isn't about anything, right? Physical objects are taken not to have intentionality because they're not about anything. They just are the thing that they are. But a thought is always directed at something. It's intentional object. It's always about something. Emotions are typically taken to always be about something, even if you don't recognize what or can't identify what they're about. they are about something, they have that intentionality to them. But feeling in Schopenhauer's sense, as far as I can glean from the way he talks about it, does not have intentionality. It's just like this direct embodiment of the world that we can become aware of, but it's not that the feeling is about the world. The feeling just is the world. The feeling is this, so you kind of think about it, you could think about it like a pain. Now, a pain is a sensation which may be different from a feeling, but it has the shared commonality that pains don't have intentionality. A pain isn't about something. You can attribute a cause to a pain, but a pain is just a pain. It's not a pain about X, Y, or Z, right? And that's true also of feeling. The difference with feeling, and this is one of the kind of implausible aspects of Schopenhauer's argument here, he claims that feeling is non-spatial. I mean, typically, I can't really think of feeling except as being located somewhere in my body. I mean, I experience it, I think. I mean, there's maybe a question about whether we really experience um, ourselves in space or if we experience space as surrounding ourselves,
Mhm.
right? I mean, there is kind of this idea that the uh, the transcendental like subject, right, that synthesizes all of space and time or whatever, or all of the world into some kind of unified picture, it has no dimensionality, right? And I think that that's what he's trying to develop here, this idea that it's not just through these um, sort of rational arguments that you can get to the idea of this non-dimensional self that is, um, sort of surrounded by space, but is not itself spatial. You can also get there through feeling. If you think of feeling as non-spatial, it's just this sort of direct embodied awareness. The body itself will be in space, but the feeling is perhaps not in space. Do you want to say something, Arshia?
I just had a couple of questions. One is that can we think of intentionality as the same thing as the subject's ability to make judgments?
I wouldn't say that it is the same thing as. I would say that intentionality um, would be the ability to apply concepts, perhaps, right?
Mm.
I'm not sure even there if it's exactly the same thing. I'd have to think about if there are any, you know, parties of intentionality that are not shared by the application of concepts. I mean, what Brentano argues is that intentionality is a key feature of every mental state, right?
Sounds
So
like
one thing that defines the mental or distinguishes it from the physical is that it's intentional. Did you want to say something, Sandesh?
oh, I said it sounds like it's closer to interest
Mm.
Why do,
as
why do you think it's closer to interest?
um well, from what you're saying about intentionality, it's like if you didn't have some sort of an intention or interest in, let's say, a particular, I mean, we kind of move around the world because we have interest, right? If I say like this is a cup, well, I have an interest towards the existence of this cup, or maybe I have some sort of an intentionality towards the existence of this cup, right? So that's what
Well,
I'm.
well, yeah, I think intentionality is more general than interest. I mean, interest means essentially motivation with respect to an object, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, if I have an interest, it means that I'm motivated to act in a certain way relative to whatever my interest is. If I'm thirsty, there is this object, can of soda, and to the extent that I want to describe my drinking of the can of soda, I'm going to describe it in terms of, uh, in this case, a causal motivation wherein I relate to the cup uh, from the point of view of my motivation to quench my thirst, right? But intentionality is much more general than that. Intentionality just means the capacity of, in many cases, seemingly unrelated or at least formally distinct states to be somehow a model of something else. So, like, you could think of reference in a similar way. Certain philosophers want to distinguish between direct and derived intentionality. So like you might say that the word can has no formal resemblance to this thing whatsoever, right? Um, Nonetheless, the word can is about this, right? And it's that aboutness relation. That's what intentionality is. Now, the thing is that the word can has derived intentionality because can is not itself a mental state. It's something that I produce in my mental state to form a concept or whatever. The mental state itself is what has the intentionality, but I can transfer or sort of transcribe or inscribe intentionality, a sort of virtual intentionality or a sort of derived intentionality to the word can, such that it then has the reference this thing,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
That's all intentionality is. And it's that strange sort of thing where it's like, you could talk about thinking and mental awareness and so on only in terms of brain states. But then the brain states themselves are just electrical impulses. They're not about anything. It's the brain state or it's the mental state that's about something, not the brain state, right? So intentionality is that property of aboutness that mental events have, mental states or events can have, right? So, if you were, that's why, I talk about pain as a sort of interesting example because, a pain is something you're aware of, but it's not really exactly itself a mental state. The awareness of the pain would be a mental state, but the pain itself isn't a mental state. It doesn't have intentionality. It's just this brute fact of pain, right? I think that's kind of what Schopenhauer is trying to get to with this idea of feeling, right? That sort of non-inferential awareness, non-conceptual, immediate, non-intentional awareness of existing that we have that isn't itself um, certainly not conceptual, not mediated by concepts or anything. It's just sort of direct. He even claims non-spatial, right? Um, so that's what puts us in contact with the world because that's the moment that we don't just see ourselves from this detached logical point of view as an object, like I can do a conceptual analysis to uh, demonstrate the fact that I must have a body or something like that, contra Descartes or whatever. That would be a way of coming into contact with the fact that you have a body, thinking about it, forming concepts about it. Or you could just be in your body and experience it directly. Maybe there are a few other kind of ways to get to the idea. One way that I've talked about it in my analysis class is so let's say we're analyzing a piece of music. We could, or no, let me take a step back. That's presupposing something I don't want to presuppose. Let's say we really want to grasp or come into some kind of deep awareness or appreciation of a piece of music. One activity we might do to that end is to analyze it very thoroughly, right? To look up all of its various relationships and, maybe define a few key relationships, whatever, and then find instances of those relationships and, put together a model of the piece in analysis, right? Another way to get into that sort of deep awareness and appreciation of the piece of music is to just give a really great performance of the piece of music. And there we are, in some sense, grasping it much more adequately than when we build a model of it, because the model's not the thing. The analytical, essay about the piece of music is very different from the piece of music. But a really great performance of it is a situation in which we, in grasping its depth or its entirety or whatever, in trying to get this really powerful grasp on it, we're doing it through embodying it, not through building a model of it.
What about the fact that sometimes people find a greater appreciation for a piece of music by virtue of analyzing it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that people do that. I guess the first of all I'm trying to do with that is point up how we can distinguish between things like representation, analysis, model building, and will or experience or embodiment, right? All of these things are um, together in groups, right? So the title of this book is The World as Will and Representation. Representation means model building, thinking, analysis. Um, it also means the fact that certain modes of perception are subject to things like space and time as normative constraints and so on, right? So, it's not that it's just thinking versus perceiving, um, but it's this idea that there are two different ways to encounter reality in some sense, thinking about it or sort of just like involving yourself in it, right? And so involving yourself, that's will. Thinking about it or building models or analyzing it, that's representation, right? And the argument is essentially that actually getting involved in life instead of sitting around in your armchair thinking about it is much more adequate to reality than its opposite, right? Because its opposite at best is getting you closer to a model of reality, not reality, right? Yeah, so
Mm.
that's essentially the claim, right? And then there are all sorts of complications where it's like, well, can you ever get to feeling or embodiment or whatever without having some conceptual element and so on? And there are a lot of people that will dissent from what Schopenhauer is arguing, but that's essentially the argument, and or at least the assertion that and it's a fairly, in some sense, almost platitudinous kind of idea. It's like you spend your life in school learning all sorts of things, maybe at the expense of learning through actually experiencing these things yourself, right? So that's the idea that if you really want to get in contact with the world, with reality, it's probably much better to throw yourself full into the experience of it. And so a claim that he makes is it's only if you do that that your concepts really have any adequacy, right?
Mm.
Your concepts are always going to be nothing more than um, references to your experience, right?
Yeah, but he does talk about will and, let's say, the manifestation of the will, like as a bodily experience or whatever, as being as being a single event,
Mhm.
and they're
Yeah.
not they don't differ in kind, right? Um, and it's
Well, they don't. Yeah, the things that they put us in touch with are coextensional, right? I mean, they are. It is the same world that we're coming into contact with, either through embodiment, will, etc., or representation. It's not that one of those worlds is false exactly. He does make the claim that um, those modes of activity that are experiential, music or these sorts of things, are in some sense more adequate because they don't have this intermediary step of objectifying the world. Okay, so one of the things he says, and it gets very complicated. He has this idea, like if you're going to just kind of draw a map of reality according to Schopenhauer, it would look something like this. There's this weird thing called will that's sort of constantly, uh, in the state of upheaval, constantly turning against itself and, whatever. That's will. It's sort of like this basic um, energy that flows through everything, right? Although I should say that it's not necessarily physical, right? And this is one of the things that gets complicated. Will is itself not physical. It's also not temporal. And then you might think, well, how can it be changing if it's not temporal? As I just said, time is an illusion. So if we think will is real and time is an illusion, will can't be in time. So then how is it changing and all this kind of stuff? So that's one question maybe to raise. Um, then, it's also not physical, right? But nonetheless, it manifests in or is mirrored by the physical world. So we do want to think about how that's possible. Um, and what other questions are left on the table? One thing that we might want to. So here's one thing that might seem like a problem for Schopenhauer. Let's take, in the kind of abbreviated version of his argument that we accept that thinking about, analyzing, etc., reasoning about the world is at best forming a model of the world. And if you really want to get in touch with the world, you have to do it through feeling. And your access point to feeling is your own body. Let's grant all of that. How is he justified in moving from the claim you can have direct awareness of the world through your body to the claim that awareness puts you in touch with the entirety of reality? Right? Because it still seems like if it's just my own body, I'm not justified in saying, oh, therefore I know that the moon is also subject to this, and every other person is also subject to this. At best, I should only have the perspective of my own body. So how can he justify this idea that we can access the world through our bodies, and that access gives us this um, uh, apprehension of the world as one indistinguishable and indistinguished, you know, mass or whatever we want to call it, called will, right? Where does that holism claim find its justification?
This was one of the questions I wrote down because in the article, it doesn't really say how this transition happens from like to the subjective universality or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about Kant and how he arrives at in the Analytic of the Beautiful at subjective universality. One of the arguments is that everyone has the same sort of cognitive structure, and
yeah, he argues for it so in the it's a little different. He's arguing for a different thing, but he argues for the universality of a judgment about beauty from the possibility of communication. If communication is ever at all possible, then there's going to be some universal aspect to it, right? And so from there, he can justify his claim for universality. This is a little different, right? Here, what Schopenhauer is claiming is, in addition to the idea that thinking or whatever representation just gives us a model of reality, one of the illusions of that model, one of the falsehoods of that model, is that what exists is plural, distinct things, distinct objects, distinct people, whatever, right? Somehow, through feeling, he is trying to make the claim or justify the claim that through feeling, we become aware that distinctions are false. How can that work? Yeah.
Could it be that like being an idealist, he would think that we experience the world kind of coming through this funnel that's like our bodily experience. And so because it all comes through from like one channel, then it just necessarily becomes one experience. And as a result, there is that universal,
Well,
the
yeah,
universal
but
aspect.
even so, that would be phenomenal, right? He's actually claiming that the world itself is one. Not
Uh,
just that our phenomenon, our phenomenal awareness is one. Sure, that's fine. I don't think many people would have a problem with that. He wants to actually claim that, in addition to the fact that our consciousness is unified, which nobody would ever deny. I mean, it's not like, my consciousness is a patchwork of all sorts of different consciousnesses. No, it's my consciousness. Nobody denies that. What he's claiming, in addition to that, is that the world really is unified. So how can he argue with that? And here it would be the sort of thing where I always admonish people to think like car mechanics, to look at your tool belt and look at what kind of tools you have, philosophical tools. What sort of argument forms could be a tool that would get you from A to B in this case, from um, his claim about apprehension of the world through feeling to his claim about the uh, the non-distinction, the holism, the absolute connectedness of the world. What you would have to do is see if you can limit the idea of distinction to certain domains that you can then negate. You'd have to ask, does the concept distinction make sense? Or maybe are there limited uh, spheres in which the concept distinction makes sense and outside of which it makes no sense? And then if you can show that those spheres are inconsistent or incoherent, then you can claim, therefore, distinction is incoherent. Is it clear what I'm saying? Okay. Um, I'll put it into a simple example. It's the same argument form, basically. Um, let's say I believe in goblins and you don't. And then I say, okay, if goblins exist at all, they exist in this can. Then I look in the can, I see no goblins. Therefore, I'm justified in concluding goblins don't exist. Right? If you can limit, that's a stupid example because, goblin is a empirical concept and not a formal concept, right? But that's basically the form, right? Like if you can limit a concept, if you can provide an argument for the limitation of the concept, and then you can show that the specific sphere in which you've limited the concept is incoherent, then whatever is in that sphere is incoherent. So, for instance, if I say, here's the way that Schopenhauer would do it. What are how can we talk about distinction at all? What is presupposed in the very idea of distinction? If you can show that the presupposition is somehow false, then the thing that presupposes it is also, uh, well, I won't go down that path, but let's start with the first the first question. What's presupposed in the very idea of distinction?
existence.
Not necessarily, because he's claiming that the world really does exist and it's indistinguishable. So existence can't be the answer.
Perception.
Yeah, and why is that? Unpack that argument. Why does perception presuppose distinction?
Um, I guess, well, that might be more of a phenomenal thing, like you were saying. I was maybe thinking about it simply, but to like in a literal sense, to perceive or to like have an awareness of two distinct objects, you have to be able to perceive two
Yeah,
objects
and
or
not
an
only perceive
object or
them, but
something.
perceive them spatio-temporally. In other words, if we're talking about at least uh, quantitative distinction, you can't have the concept quantitative distinction except in space and time, right? That is to say, when I say quantitative distinction, what I mean is even if this object were, these are total, the properties of these objects are really different. But let's say that I just have two cans that look exactly identical. Like every atom is exactly in the same relationship to every other atom in two different cans, but you can still see them as numerically distinct. Why? Because they take up two different spatial locations. Or maybe they take up two different temporal points or something like this. But the point is that as regards perception, you can only have distinction in space and time. If we can demonstrate that space and time are illusions, then distinction goes away too. So that's one way to get to it. The other thing that he says, and this is one of the places that is a little bit problematic, um, the other way that we could get distinction, which would still be phenomenal. So I need to define phenomenal. Phenomenal essentially means, in Schopenhauer's telling, something that we can be aware of, I suppose. I'm not completely sure. Because the other way that we could get distinction is in terms of thought, right? Not perception necessarily, but thinking one is different than two, right? And those, I'm not perceiving them. They don't even have to have a spatial location or potentially even a temporal location. Um, but I think what Schopenhauer would say is, yeah, but you can't have that thought except in time. You have to have that thought in time. And if time is actually just an illusion, then the distinction in that thought, which relies on time, is also an illusion. So the way that he gets to this idea that the world is one is simply by arguing that the only domains in which distinction is coherent are false. Therefore, distinction is false. Now, whether or not that argument really works, and certainly that doesn't give us the further argument that we can then become aware of that through feeling. But certainly one thing that would become clear is that we can't actually come into contact with the oneness of the world by thinking about it. Because in thinking, we always have to think in terms of distinction. You can't have thought except with distinction. If it's possible that there is, actually, I should be even more specific. It's not even necessarily distinction that is the problem here. It's individuation. Individuation. The difference between distinction and individuation is that individuation means that there is no continuity between things. So you could have distinction between things that are nonetheless united if there's some kind of continuity between them, right? Like, it makes sense to say that I have distinct fingers, but they're all part of the continuity of my hand.
Like a musical stream or an auditory
Yeah,
stream.
for instance, something like that. Like a melody is made up of distinct notes, but it's also a melody, and there's this continuity to it. And especially if it's, a vocal melody and not, a piano or something like that, where it's actually really hard to um, point up the limit at which these things become distinguished. The ability to identify that limit is individuation. Distinction might still be possible, even if individuation is impossible. Is that clear?
If
Well,
you give one more example, it might make it even better for my
okay.
understanding.
Let me give you
Because otherwise, it seems to me like an obvious gestalt kind of thing.
Sorry, to clarify, is he arguing that distinction is false or that
it's
individuation is?
individuation. So
Okay.
I should have been more clear a moment ago, because you do still need distinction to talk about the world as it is in itself. But what you don't have and what he doesn't want is this idea of individuation. And individuation is just a more radical kind of distinction. Individuation means there is a gap between distinguished things, right?
This might be a stupid question, but if he's arguing that there is no individuation and we're accessing the world through feeling, how is it that we're not able to access or experience someone else's feeling?
He thinks we are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he does think we are. That's why he starts to. So for him, compassion, this idea of feeling with Mitgefühl, is like a huge part of his ethics. And it's from this picture of the world that we're actually all one.
But you can't actually you experience someone else's when you experience like affective empathy, you experience what you think their affect is, but you can't truly know.
Oh, well, maybe the confusion is because you're second guessing your feeling. Maybe the feeling was right, and the only reason that you think it wasn't right is that in thinking about it, you have become confused.
Well, maybe, but how would you prove that? Like you
Uh,
can
in
you can
activity,
misinterpret.
well, here's the thing. You wouldn't prove it by laying out concepts and definitions and arguing for it. You'd prove it through your activity. Like, for instance, someone's sad and you come in and you give them a hug. If that was a felicitous action, if it was the right thing for them in that moment, then you got it right. And that's how you proved it. You did it in the action, not in a linguistic conceptual analysis, right?
Okay. I guess, yeah, in this case, it's enough to say that it is possible to co-experience somebody's feelings, not that it's necessarily possible to consistently do it correctly, because you're
Yeah,
able to
yeah,
misperceive through
yeah,
your other
right. You
senses
could
as
get it
well.
wrong. You could get it wrong. I mean, he would claim that you can at least sometimes get it right. And you can get it right not by thinking about it, but by somehow engaging with your environment in a sympathetic way. Sympathy here meaning that um, there is a formal isomorphism or a formal similarity or formal sameness, really, to your affective state or your activity and the world, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So, and you're also identifying one of the most contentious parts of his whole project, right? This idea that certainly um, it's very hard to accept this idea that distinction is not actually a condition of the world. Although I suppose if you, I don't know enough about theoretical physics, and I don't think theoretical physics know physicists know enough because these are all big open questions. But this idea that if you really want to learn about matter and how it's defined and so on, you'll come to realize that matter is an incoherent concept and that it must have something to do with sort of energy fields interacting in certain ways that give rise to certain sorts of apparent things, but the things themselves are actually these energistic processes. I mean, just the idea of a table. A table is not a thing. It's not solid. It's mostly empty space and particles moving around, right? And those particles are themselves not really things. They are like particular ways of describing energy relationships and this kind of thing, right? That's kind of what Schopenhauer is getting to here as well, that at that point you can see that the fact that we see things as things doesn't really tap into the way the world, at least potentially, is in itself if things are illusions, right? If what exists is not a bunch of things, but processes, right? And the thing is that you can't talk about process except forming it into a noun, which is a thing. But nonetheless, it's still a coherent concept to think that whatever you call a thing can always be reduced to processes. Particles moving around, strings vibrating, whatever. Um, you know, and if that's the case, then there are no things. What there is quote unquote processes, but processes are actually just in some sense continuous with each other, right? So when you're asking Jonathan for an example of how we can get individuation, or I'm sorry, distinction without individuation, what I would say is think about a process. Okay. At any stage is distinct from the previous ones or the later ones, but it's also continuous with, right? So you can't have distinction. You don't have individuation because there's no moment in the process that you have that left of state A, state B, state C. State A develops into state B, which develops into state C, right? And those states are just sort of, you know, um, easy ways to kind of talk about it, but they're not actually adequate to the notion of a process because a process doesn't have states, it's always in motion.
It's kind of like the paradox of the heap, right?
I mean, a process could be thought of as a heap that it's very hard to or impossible to, you know, identify the exact moment that, say, state A becomes state B. But if you go back far enough in time, you'll see that state A is quite different from state B. It's just that the process of differentiation, of distinction, is all continuous. So, philosophers from Socrates on talk about this as becoming, right? So you've got being, which might be a state, or not being, which would be the absence of a state. But then you've got becoming, which is somehow both and neither being and not being. If, uh, state A is becoming state B, in becoming, it's not state A and it's not state B. So it's neither of them, but it also incorporates state A. I mean, it doesn't make sense to talk about state A except by virtue of the process. But at the same time, it's also becoming state B. So it's sort of both and neither at the same time. That's what becoming is, right? To become old means that at no given point are you actually any specific age. Your age is always changing, right? But it's not that nothing is happening, nothing exists. So it's not that there's non-being. It's not that there are these fixed states of being. It's this continuous change, which gives you distinction, but not individuation, because it's continuous distinction. It's continuous change, right? And this is what he claims that in the second essay on pessimism, from the Studies in Pessimism, he talks about how the world is essentially becoming and not being.
And
Right.
is this the way he also equates will and music in some way or form? Because it sounds to me as if the two subjects are in the same pool, but I'm still not connecting them in my own mind. This becoming thing is the same way that music is unfolded as it is being experienced, or something like that.
Yeah.
I should say unfolds, not unfolded. Sorry.
Yeah.
Terry, I just want to say goodbye. I have to leave to get to
Okay.
school.
Yeah,
But
maybe we should hold off until next week and just
Okay.
an hour a week or so, or an
Yeah,
hour.
that's a lot. I mean, I feel like I
One
kind
thing I
of
will say, though, I won't answer that question, but one thing I will say is that hopefully maybe it's clear that if we're talking about becoming and not temporal change, you can see that becoming has a kind of logical structure to it, but is independent of time because all becoming is, definitionally, is the synthesis of being and not being. But we haven't said anything about time. Right? So time might be one way that we represent becoming to ourselves in perception, but becoming is independent of time. Becoming is simply the synthesis of being and non-being.
We already talked about this, but doesn't change require time?
Let's answer that next time. You can think about it for a week and see if you can come up with a good answer.
okay. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. All right. I'll see y'all next time.
could you send the recording and whenever you get a
Yeah,
chance?
that might
Oh,
be a
yeah,
handy
sure.
thing. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'll
Thanks.
do that. Sure.
All right. Thank you. See you
Yeah.
later.
Later. Bye-bye.